Good evening, students. Today we will be starting on our Civil War Odyssey with the American Civil War Lecture Part 1. I would like you to use Cornell notes. Use the slide headings to create guiding questions for your notes or any guiding questions that you possibly come up with. Things to focus on for this lecture are what states formed the Union, what states formed the Confederacy, battles, who won, who lost, what tactics were employed, what was the significance of the battle. And lastly, strategy. What was the strategy employed by each side, and how were they developed over time? Please make sure to summarize your notes at the end. Thank you very much, and please enjoy. Welcome. We're going to discuss the American Civil War, battles, and new technologies that were developed. The American Civil War would divide the United States in half. The blue states and the green states would be referred to as the Union, or the North. The gray states would be referred to as the Confederacy, or the South. These two areas would fight a very vicious civil war over the next 4 years, resulting in the deaths of 400 or hundreds of thousands of individuals. The first states to secede would be the states in red: South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Louisiana, and Texas. They would be quickly followed by Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia. Tennessee would be the last state to secede and would be the first state to be welcomed back into the Union after the Civil War. While the war was fought on the fault line of slavery, not all slave states seceded. Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland and Delaware would stay within the United States, and West Virginia would actually secede from the state of Virginia to become an American state in 1863 as a new slave state. While slavery was noted as one of the biggest causes of the Civil War, it is important to note that northern states still did have slaves during the war and would not free their slaves until 1865. Now, the southern population was significantly smaller than the northern population, and this gave it a significant disadvantage, with only 9 million people compared to the North's 22 million people. And out of that 9 million people, roughly 3 million were enslaved, with states like South Carolina and Mississippi having a majority of slave in the population. This would result with the South having roughly half of the fighting men of the North basically throughout the entire war, giving the South a supreme disadvantage during the fighting. Fittingly, the first shots of the Civil War would be fired at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina being the state that started the secessionist ideas all the way back during the presidency of Andrew Jackson with the nullification crisis. After the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln, South Carolina saw that they had little recourse but to secede from the United States. So, on April 10, 1861, Confederate forces demanded that the Union surrender the garrison at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The garrison commander, Major Anderson, refused to surrender the garrison, and so on April 12th, Confederate batteries opened fire. The fighting would last roughly one whole day, from April 12th to April 13th, and after a day's worth of fighting, Fort Sumter was surrendered and evacuated the following day. There were no casualties during the actual firefight, but however, upon the surrendering ceremonies, 2 people were killed by a backfiring cannon that was set to fire a salute during the evacuation on April 14th. The first shots of the war were fired by the Confederacy, and the Union was forced out of southern military positions. The first real battles of the war, however, were fought in and around Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia. The very first battle that we will discuss is the Battle of Bull Run, fought just 25 miles outside of Washington, D.C. The first Battle of Bull Run, as it is known in the North, or the Battle of Manassas, as it is known in the South, was fought near Manassas, Virginia on July 21, 1861, and this would be the first real battle of the American Civil War. Union forces would often name battles after a local geographical focal point, such as Bull Run Creek, where the Confederacy would name battles after a local town, such as Manassas, Virginia. Unseasoned Army troops led by Brigadier General Irvin McDowell advanced across the Bull Run Creek towards equally unseasoned Confederate Army under the Generals Joseph E. Johnston and P.T. Beauregard. And despite the Union Army's early success, they were routed and forced to retreat back to Washington, D.C. This is where famed Confederate General Thomas Stonewall Jackson receives his nickname for standing like a stone wall against a Union volley of fire and rallying his troops to make a devastating charge towards Union forces, scaring the bejesus out of them. As Union soldiers broke ranks, 460 were killed, 1,124 were wounded, and roughly 1,300 went missing or captured. The Confederate casualties, while high, were still less: 387 killed, 1,582 wounded, and only 13 missing in action. This battle signified that while the Southerners were poorly equipped and poorly trained, that they would not go down without a very, very fierce fight. Given the battle's geographic location near Washington, D.C., the forces in D.C. were quite concerned that the Confederates would advance on Washington, D.C., and that there would be generally very little standing in their way. And on July 24th, Confederates were observed moving in and about Manassas Junction and Fairfax County, and they were ascertained that there was no evidence of massing rebel forces. Because of Washington, D.C.'s location, however, it was extremely vulnerable to attack, both surrounded by slave states Maryland and Virginia. The Union strategy was essentially to isolate and cut off and invade the South using a superior man force, a superior railroad tracks, and a superior navy to basically encircle and encapsulate the Confederacy in one massive blockade. The idea of the blockade came from General Winfield Scott. At 73, he felt that he was too old and too fat to either ride or fight in the war. However, his military mind was still good. He devised what he called the Anaconda Plan, named for the famous constrictor snake, and the idea was to choke the South into submission by surrounding its eastern Atlantic Ocean ports, as well as its ports in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as cutting it off from the Mississippi River. This would destroy the southern economy by making it impossible to ship cotton to either France or Britain. While Britain did attempt to run the blockade, it never would side with the South because of the issue of slavery. Over time, the blockade would cause food shortages and other goods, and this would force hyperinflation in the South and bread riots as well. Because of the naval blockade, both sides unleashed new technology, ironclad battleships. And on March 8, 1862, these two ironclad battleships, the CSS Virginia, formerly the USS Merrimack, and the USS Monitor, met in a fierce battle in southern Virginia. The two ships pounded away at each other for hours on end. However, neither one could pierce the other's iron hull. This was a strategic victory for the North because it sustained the blockade and it showed that this type of technology would be extremely successful over the course of the war. The U.S. would go on to build many more carbon copies of the Monitor, where the Confederates would eventually lose the Merrimack, their only Ironside ship. The Union Army's massive navy was successfully able to blockade pretty much all major southern ports, especially Charleston, Savannah, and especially New Orleans. The Union blockade choked off southern ports, making the southern economy crumble. They did not allow trade with Europe, and it made the southern states get very difficult to get basic staples of living. The Union blockade would also be successful in the eventual seizure of the most important port and the largest city in the South, New Orleans. By seizing New Orleans, the United States would have control of the mouth of the Mississippi River, thus making the Mississippi essentially worthless to other southern states such as Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas, thus further crippling the economy of the South. Summarize your notes based on the early battles, who had the upper hand in the war, and why.